I gave him everything. My youth, my trust, my silence. For years, I believed in us, in the promises whispered behind closed doors. But promises are cheap when weighed against cold contracts and sharper knives called lawyers. When the divorce came, I was left with nothing. No home, no money, no future. Just a name on a piece of paper. Stripped of everything that once made me whole. They say justice is blind, but justice saw me clearly, as a liability to be discarded, a pawn to be sacrificed. I remember the exact moment I realized he never loved me. Not really. Love? It was a game. And I was just a piece on his chessboard, moved, manipulated, and ultimately thrown away. But pawns can become queens. I buried my pain deep inside, behind a smile no one believed. But beneath the surface, a fire grew, cold, calculated, relentless. I made a silent vow that day. I would not walk away empty-handed. This isn't just a story about loss. It's the story of my revenge. Chapter 1, The Fallout, 2 to 8. The courtroom was cold, not just because of the marble floors or the high ceilings, but because it was a place where dreams went to die. I sat there, watching the faces around me, the judge, the lawyers, the so-called justice, and I realized they were all actors playing a part in a twisted theater. James knew this game better than anyone. He smiled at the right moments, nodded at the right words, and hid his greed behind a mask of concern. The man I once thought I loved was nothing more than a player, a man whose greatest skill was deception. I spoke. I pleaded. I tried to show who I was beyond the paperwork. But none of it mattered. The law was a fortress built to protect people like him, rich, powerful, untouchable. I watched as the judge handed over the house, our memories, to him. The accounts that should have been mine emptied without a trace. The life I thought we built together crumbled into dust. When the gavel finally fell, it wasn't just a sound. It was a sentence. A death sentence to everything I was. I remember walking out of that courtroom with nothing but a small bag and my own name. No home, no money, no future. Just a name on a piece of paper. Stripped of everything that once made me whole. They thought that because I had lost everything, I would fade away. That I would become another statistic, a cautionary tale about women who couldn't hold on. But they underestimated the power of a woman with nothing left to lose. I didn't cry. Not then. Not in that moment when the world had turned its back on me. Instead, I sat alone in a cheap motel room, staring at the ceiling, and I planned. I thought about every secret James kept, every lie he told, every corner he cut to build his empire. I knew he was vulnerable. I just had to find the cracks. Revenge isn't a sudden strike. It's a slow burn, a quiet storm gathering strength. I started small. A few questions, a few whispers to the right people. I listened. I watched. I learned. I studied the shadows where he thought no one dared to look. James was powerful, but arrogance is the greatest weakness of all. He never saw me coming. Every meeting I had, every contact I made, was a thread weaving a web around him. And with each passing day, the web grew tighter. I thought about the years I wasted, the the nights spent pretending everything was fine. And I promised myself that I would take it all back, and more. Because justice, as I learned, isn't always blind. Sometimes it just needs a sharp edge to cut through the lies. I was that edge. The fallout from the divorce wasn't just the loss of material things. It was the shattering of trust, the erosion of identity, the brutal awakening to who I really was and what I was capable of. They thought the end of our marriage was the end of my story, but it was only the beginning.
When the dust settled and I found myself standing alone in the ruins of what was once my life, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The system had failed me. The law didn't care about my pain, my sacrifices, or the lies I'd lived with. It cared only for power, money, and influence, all of which belonged to him now. So if justice wouldn't come to me, I would have to seize it with my own hands. But revenge is never simple. It's never clean. And it is certainly never kind. It is a slow, twisting path, one that demands patience, precision, and a cold heart. I began by erasing the woman I once was, the hopeful wife, the trusting partner, all gone, buried beneath layers of ice and calculation. I had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The first step was knowledge. I needed to know everything, every lie he told, every secret deal, every hidden account. I spent endless nights poring over scraps of information, bank statements, leaked emails, whispers from people on the fringes of his world. I became a ghost in the shadows, watching, listening, piecing together a web of deceit that stretched far beyond what I ever imagined. I learned that his fortune wasn't built on honest work. It was built on betrayal, corruption, and ruthless manipulation. But information was only the beginning. I needed allies, people who could help me navigate the dark corners of the world he controlled. I reached out to hackers skilled enough to dig where the law feared to tread. I found disgruntled employees, bitter and willing to trade secrets for a chance at their own revenge. And I even crossed paths with shadowy figures who understood the art of intimidation, who could deliver warnings without leaving fingerprints. Every connection I made, every secret I uncovered, became a weapon in my arsenal. But I had to be careful. I wore the mask of defeat perfectly, quiet, broken, harmless. No one suspected that beneath the surface, a storm was gathering strength. I found a job, modest, unremarkable, to keep the world from noticing me. I learned to smile without hope, to speak without passion. The perfect disguise for a woman who was plotting the downfall of a king. I kept meticulous notes, charts, timelines. Every transaction, every meeting, every inconsistency was recorded. I built a map of his empire, and, more importantly, its vulnerabilities. One of the most crucial moves was finding someone on the inside, a federal agent disillusioned by the system's corruption, someone hungry for justice, or perhaps just hungry for the truth. I fed them carefully gathered evidence, small enough to seem coincidental, but damning when seen as a whole. I became a ghost in the shadows, watching, listening, piecing together a web of deceit that stretched far beyond what I ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Every moment was a step closer to the trap I was setting. I remembered all the nights I spent pretending everything was fine, all the times I swallowed my pain to keep the peace. Now I was ready to make him taste that same bitterness. But I also knew that vengeance would come with a price. This wasn't about happiness or closure, it was about power, control, and balance. I had become a shadow, a whisper, a force that no one could predict. The plan was set, the pieces were moving, and soon the empire he had built on lies and greed would begin to crumble. because this was not just my fight, it was my reckoning. And when it was over, no one would ever underestimate Rose again. By the time I was ready to strike, I knew that a direct confrontation was nothing but a suicide mission. James was no ordinary man. He was surrounded by walls built of power, money, and loyalty bought with lies. To topple such a man, I needed to be smarter, quieter, deadlier. So I became a patient predator, the kind that doesn't rush. I laid my poison slowly, drop by drop, in places no one would suspect. A whispered rumor to a key partner, an anonymous tip to a regulator, a forged document slipped under the right door. It was a delicate dance, every move calculated to cause cracks without exposing myself. I learned that the smallest doubt can grow into a chasm, that trust once broken is nearly impossible to rebuild. I remember the thrill of the first tremors in his empire, the way a casual mention in a board meeting made his confident gaze flicker, the way his once unshakable allies started casting nervous glances at one another. But I knew better than to rush. The poison I crafted wasn't meant to kill outright. It was to weaken, to confuse, to unravel. My network grew quietly. Hackers who could bypass firewalls, accountants who whispered about irregularities, journalists hungry for scandal. Every contact was a thread weaving a web that would ensnare him. I fed them pieces of the puzzle, not enough to convict at first, but enough to spark curiosity, enough to ignite suspicion. The secrets I held were darker than most imagined. Hidden accounts in tax havens, forged contracts, bribes disguised as donations, lies layered on top of lies, a house of cards built to protect a king's throne. And slowly, those cards began to fall. The media caught wind of financial irregularities. Regulators opened investigations. Investors started to withdraw, sensing instability. James was no longer invincible. He was becoming vulnerable. Meanwhile, I stayed in the shadows, a ghost watching the collapse unfold. I never made a single direct move. No emails, no phone calls, no trace. The perfect invisibility. I saw the panic grow in his eyes through intercepted videos, heard the tension in his faltering voice during calls I managed to record. His empire was fracturing from within, and I was the unseen force cracking its foundation. But I knew I had to be meticulous. One mistake, one careless whisper, and I could lose everything: my freedom, my safety, my chance at justice. So I planned the next phase with surgical precision. I began to plant fabricated evidence, documents that linked him to money laundering, illegal contracts, and even ties to criminal organizations. With the help of my allies in law enforcement, these documents were discovered during routine audits and investigations. Timing was crucial. The evidence had to appear genuine, yet undeniable. I remember the nights spent crafting these forgeries, the countless hours reviewing details to ensure no mistakes, no contradictions. Each signature, each figure had to be perfect. This wasn't just revenge, it was a masterpiece of deception, a calculated strike at the heart of his power. I fought my own doubts too. Some nights I questioned the path I'd chosen. Was I becoming the monster he feared? Was the thirst for vengeance worth the cost to my soul? But then I remembered the years of betrayal, the nights spent crying alone, the humiliation of losing everything. I knew I was reclaiming my life, my dignity, and so I pressed on. The poison continued to spread. His bank accounts were frozen, his assets tied up in legal battles. His closest allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to be caught in the storm. The media frenzy grew louder, fueled by leaks I carefully orchestrated. Headlines screamed of fraud, corruption, and impending doom. And then the moment I'd been waiting for, the arrest warrant. I saw the footage of James being taken into custody, his arrogance replaced by shock, his power stripped away in a single moment. I felt no joy in his fall, only a quiet, cold satisfaction. This was just the beginning of the reckoning. I knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but the poison was working, slowly, inevitably. It was destroying him, and I was ready to watch his empire crumble to dust. The moment the arrest warrant was signed, the ground beneath James began to quake. He was no longer the untouchable titan. He was a man exposed, vulnerable, surrounded by enemies who had been waiting for this moment. I watched him carefully, like a hawk circling a wounded prey, from a distance so close yet unseen. His empire, the lavish offices, the shiny cars, the countless properties, suddenly felt like fragile glass ready to shatter. The media frenzy was immediate. Cameras camped outside his penthouses, reporters digging through every corner of his life. Headlines blasted accusations of embezzlement, fraud, and betrayal. His name was smeared across the news like blood on a battlefield. He had once ruled a kingdom of wealth and influence, but now his every move was questioned, every word dissected. The court of public opinion was swift and merciless. Even his closest allies, those who had stood by him through thick and thin, began to slip away like shadows at dusk. Phone calls went unanswered, meetings were canceled, loyalty evaporated like morning mist. James was a prisoner not just of iron bars, but of the crumbling legacy he had built on lies. The legal battles were brutal. Days turned into weeks, and every hearing felt like a war zone. Prosecutors unleashed the evidence I had so carefully collected: secret ledgers showing offshore accounts, falsified contracts implicating him in money laundering, and testimonies from once fearful insiders now freed from his grip. In the courtroom, James transformed before my eyes. His usual arrogance replaced by desperation, his confident smirk faded into grimaces of frustration. The powerful man I had once feared was now broken. But it was not only the public downfall that I witnessed. The personal toll was immense. I remembered the nights I cried alone, the quiet heartbreak of losing not just a husband, but my entire world. But here I was, standing tall, the architect of his ruin. Revenge had carved me into a different person, colder, harder, yet somehow more alive. Outside the courtroom, his life unraveled even faster. Banks froze his accounts, partners severed business ties, luxury cars were repossessed, properties were placed under government control. I followed every development meticulously, my heart a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. The man who had taken everything from me was finally being stripped bare. His public image, once flawless, was now in tatters. Once loyal employees whispered in fear, gossip spreading like wildfire.
Social circles that had welcomed him with open arms now shunned him as a pariah. At times, I wondered if this was truly justice, or if I had simply become a vengeful ghost haunting the ruins of a man I once loved. The trial's climax was a day I will never forget. The courtroom was packed. The tension was palpable. Every eye was on James as the verdict was read. The jury's silence stretched into eternity before the foreman spoke the word that would change everything. Guilty. There was no celebration on my part, only a quiet relief, a closing of a painful chapter. James's fall was complete, sentenced to years in bars, stripped of all titles, and ordered to repay what he had stolen. But my victory was more than legal. It was the reclaiming of my identity, my dignity, my life. I walked away from that courtroom
not as a broken woman, but as someone reborn. The empire was gone, but in its place, a new future awaited. One built not on lies, but on truth and resilience. And though the scars remained, I knew that I had finally taken back what was rightfully mine. As the sun set on his downfall, it rose on my beginning. After the verdict, a strange calm settled over me, like the quiet after a fierce storm. James was behind bars, his empire shattered, and I was free. But freedom didn't come with fireworks or cheers. It came with a heavy silence, a realization that this victory was as complex as the war that led to it. For years, I had lived in shadows, plotting, hiding, hurting. Now, standing in the light of justice served, I felt both triumphant and hollow. I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece. The first step wasn't about money or possessions. It was about reclaiming my identity. I enrolled in classes, surrounded myself with people who believed in second chances, who saw me not as a victim, but as a survivor. I found solace in simple things: morning walks, quiet coffee shops, the pages of books that once felt like escape, but now became my refuge. But the ghosts of the past were never far. Sometimes in the stillness of night, I would hear echoes of betrayal and loss. The pain was a shadow I carried, a reminder of what was taken and what had been won. Yet with every step forward, I felt stronger. The chains James had wrapped around my life were broken, and I was finally free to live on my own terms. Justice was more than a court verdict. It was a transformation, from a woman crushed by betrayal to one who took control, who refused to be silenced or erased. I met new people, formed new bonds, and slowly trust returned, fragile but real. Sometimes I would catch myself smiling, genuinely, without fear or regret. Those moments were victories too. But victory also meant forgiveness, not for James, but for myself, forgiving my own anger, my own pain, and allowing space for healing. I understood then that revenge was a chapter, not the whole story. The true victory was the life I built after the storm. I am Rose, not the broken wife who lost everything, but the woman who rose from the ashes, who turned poison into power. And now, as I look forward, I know that no one can take that away from me.
The courtroom is silent now. The echoes of the past fade into a distant memory, like whispers carried away by the wind. I stand alone, but not lonely. Strong, but not hardened. I've learned that revenge is a double-edged sword. It cuts deep, but it can also free you. What I took from this battle wasn't just justice, it was a rebirth. Outside, the world moves on. People don't know my story, don't see the scars beneath my smile, and that's okay. Because I'm no longer defined by what was taken from me. I'm defined by what I choose to build. I step forward into the light, leaving the darkness behind. The past is gone, but the future is mine. I am Rose. This is my story, and it's only just beginning.